Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be here in downtown Miami with Dr. Frances Colón. She visited UNC Chapel Hill several months ago, and I was super excited to talk to her. I had the opportunity of being part of a breakfast session, a question and answer session with her, because she worked for the Secretary of State, John Kerry, under the Obama administration as Deputy Science and Technology Advisor. And we had a great conversation about that, as well as talking to her about science communication and some of the difficulties that minorities have in science, and just in general, the difficulties that the public has with communicating with scientists and vice versa. So thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Colón.
Thank you, Connor. I'm very happy to be here.
So I guess we'll jump right into how you even transitioned from being a scientist to entering science policy. I know you applied for a fellowship, right? And that was always your dream, or you kind of discovered it along the way and figured out that science policy was more your speed versus bench work?
Yeah, when I was in grad school, I was at Brandeis. I was doing my neurobiology work. I started getting involved in things in the community in the Boston area, whether it was summer camps for Hispanic girls in STEM summer camps, whether it was getting involved with campaigns for candidates that I thought had the best interest of science at heart. I just started getting more civically engaged. And as I did that, as that happened in combination with my research, I started becoming more aware of the decisions that were being made in Washington that I agreed or disagreed with at the time. This was in the early 2000s. And at the time, decisions were being made about stem cells, what types of stem cells research could be done with or not. And I myself was working on differentiation of neurons during development. So the conversation about stem cells and how early or late they could be used and how they were going to be regulated was very relevant to me. And it was sort of that moment of when I became aware that groups of people were making decisions about science that impacted us directly. And I became very interested in that. And my PI at the time, Dr. Susan Behrend, an excellent mentor, leader, scientist, she was the one that alerted me to the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And she basically left me a note. She said, "This is so you." So I think I demonstrated enough of a civic mind, even when I was in the lab, even when doing research, and the discussions we'd have during lab meeting, just in general, where I felt that this was something that would bridge my two passions, which was community engagement and science.
Excellent. Yeah, so you basically were captured by this political engagement because of how you thought it would impact your lab work. Did the policies that were instituted on stem cell research ever actually affect the lab, or you guys were able to figure out a workaround?
They didn't. I didn't work on stem cells directly, so it wasn't a direct impact. But it certainly showed me that scientists, bench work, no matter where you are, you're never far enough, and you're never immune. And all of these decisions, at the end of the day, you're never far enough. You're never immune from the impact of these decisions. And so it became very apparent to me that even if it wasn't a direct impact, even though I wasn't directly impacted because my cell line wasn't one of the ones that was being considered for regulation, it does matter in terms of the general body of work that we're all involved in doing, the general questions that we're all involved in answering. And it's sort of the same idea of one day they came for me and there was nobody left to speak for me, right? As scientists, I think that we can be as objective as possible. We can be neutral. We can do our work keeping in mind the values that we hold dear, which is to produce the best information and knowledge and discoveries and put those forward. But when politics do happen to science, and we don't get involved and we don't speak out, then you will eventually be impacted.
Mm-hmm. We kind of need to get involved to protect ourselves, just represent ourselves, you might say, right? So I was always wondering, how many actual scientists are there in government? Because you don't hear about that so often. And I feel like you had somewhat of a unique position, but maybe you had many peers who were from the same avenue or had similar training. What were you finding in that?
Well, in government, there's definitely technical agencies that employ lots of scientists. If you think about NOAA, USGS, US Geological Survey, if you think about National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, NIH, those are all technical agencies where many experts are employed all the time. So DC is full of scientists in many ways at these technical agencies. But then there's also a whole crop of scientists that work on issues that are of a scientific nature in non-technical agencies, such as mine, at the State Department, which is the agency that does all of the international cooperation work around the world. It's the agency that manages our embassies and our relationships with other countries. In that building alone, we had at least, I would say, 100 scientists at any given point in time. And those scientists were working on nuclear non-proliferation issues and infectious disease collaboration with other countries and illegal fishing issues and many other issues, including climate change, where you needed an expertise. And those scientists were working alongside diplomats, and they were working hand in hand to produce the best results possible for our country.
Really neat. So when you think of science policy, a lot of people think of these regulations restricting how we can use science, and ultimately I think those regulations are important just to make sure we're doing things ethically, because not everyone will. But then it's also, how can we use science to affect policy, right? That's what you're describing right now. And I guess the most contentious topic right now has to be climate change in my mind. It seems like a subject where the government and the scientific community are effectively at odds with each other. There's a lack of communication, is it? Or what do you think the main issue is in terms of climate change and the government and also the public? Because I think the public has kind of some conflicting ideas of what climate change is and how it might affect them and our country and our security here.
Yeah. I actually don't think that it is a contentious issue. I think there's been a deliberate campaign from special interests to misinform the public, to spread a lot of doubt. But that has been a deliberate effort that has been, it's not that there's really questions or concerns. The science is very clear. We all know that climate change is happening. We know that it comes from human activity. And it's been documented, and all of the reports of the UN panel on climate change and all of the work that hundreds of scientists around the world have done all converge us on the same answers. So you and I, as scientists, we don't question this, because we understand that the science behind it is solid, and it has been for a long time. I think that it has been very useful to those who find the results of climate change research inconvenient to create doubt about climate change, its existence, its origin, and to do it in many ways which are really concerning, especially when it comes down to the point of funding campaigns to remove portions of text from textbooks in schools to insert many sides to the explanation of why there might be changing weather patterns into textbooks when the science is very clear. And that misinformation and that spreading of that doubt and that whole telling of the multiple sides or the multiple theories, which there are no multiple theories. Yeah. We know exactly what is happening. But it's been shown to be funded by special interests where if we were to go to a more sustainable economy, more sustainable lifestyles, there would be some losers in that economy, mainly fossil fuels, certain car manufacturers, et cetera, that would have to. Doesn't mean that they would have to close down shop completely, but it certainly means that they would have to make big investments in the infrastructure, in their own factories and their companies to adapt to a new sustainable lifestyle for citizens. And that's a big financial hit that these companies would rather not have to take. And they'd rather invest in misinformation.
Well, I know Shell is pretty famous for taking a huge push towards renewable energy. Do you think it's perhaps public pressure, consumer pressure? Can people vote with their dollar to affect this kind of stuff? What do you think, like, the best motivator towards these? I mean, ultimately money is, right? You follow the money.
Follow the money.
But how can the average person, like, use their money or use their spending? I know this is really close to home for Florida, right? Because you guys aren't legally allowed to talk about climate change, or at least use those words in actual policy documents. But
so it depends on apparently it depends on Florida is an interesting case because there's many municipal governments that are completely clear about the science, and they are doing the right thing. And in fact, 3 of these municipalities have bonded together to work with the Rockefeller Foundation for under the 100 Resilient Cities program on climate change, and they do it together, and they're all here in South Florida. And so you have a very progressive policy groups here, definitely. And there are some that are not as much. And so it's Florida's a very interesting case where a lot of these things all come to a head together in a place that is really ground zero for climate change, right? If not the first, one of the first to be, that is being impacted, will continue to be impacted. We have floods here year round that people see in their own backyards, see when they go out to run their errands. It's not something you can you can't just close your eyes. You can't just go about your business and ignore that it's happening, because property values, insurance, everything is happening here. And so it's very interesting. Folks, what you see is that policymakers, so that they don't have to be seen as backpedaling, what you see some of them do is start to speak in code. Instead of banning the words climate change, they start to talk about resiliency. They talk about sea level rise. That's in Florida, the code language for climate change is sea level rise,
which is the ultimate,
which is the impact, right?
Impact,
and so that sort of protects them from having to talk about the source of that rising sea level or that flooding that they see in their own backyards.
It's like addressing the symptom instead of the cause of the disease.
And that is what Florida has done. Florida has programs for addressing flooding. There's these programs with pumps to pull out water from different areas.
Millions of dollars on that, right?
And a lot of investments in that. And so there, many places in Florida are doing the right thing, and they are completely aware of why they are having to do these things. And more, I think what you see is an awareness and a willingness to talk about it openly, and more candidates jumping into elected office or running for office who are backed up by the right science and are talking about it openly. And Florida is having these discussions openly, especially here in South Florida.
It's really great to hear. Perhaps the tide is changing.
No pun intended.
Yeah. So, I mean, I still think with the public we have this disconnect somewhat with scientists. I know there's been a huge push lately, and hopefully we can be part of that in connecting the science directly with researchers and having an open course of conversation. Really just creating this dialogue, this conversation that's really never been there before in my perception. What do you think scientists can do to be more effective at that, and how can they reach perhaps policy managers or people who are making these decisions and kind of weigh in on the problems that they see or the problems that they are qualified to talk about?
Yeah. I think scientists for a long time were not trained in the art of science communication.
Or communication in general.
Or communication. I think it just wasn't viewed as something that they needed to be good at, because it was the skill set that the traditional scientific path, the academic path, the bench research path, the field research path, what was rewarded, what was incentivized was being a good researcher, producing great results, working really hard, publishing those in a timely fashion, getting promoted, getting tenure, getting as many grad students as possible, and the cycle would repeat itself. And pretty much science was left to do its thing, and communities would do their thing, and they would meet when something was of use to the community, whether it was a discovery, a cure, but for the most part, those things kind of happened in parallel without much intersection. I think, in my view, what happened through time was that scientists ceded the ground for the way science was communicated to the public to non-scientists, to either non-science, fake science, things that were maybe more of a supernatural nature, explanations of things, which is, it's been part of our human nature and human history to have that as part of our cultures. But the scientists were not active participants of the conversation. It wasn't ingrained into scientists that part of their job was to not only do their bench and field research, but it was also to communicate that to the public, to the decision makers, so that their findings could be of use to a broader sector of the population, right? And so I believe this is a ground that we have to reclaim. I believe that part of the reason that we see some of these anti-science movements, as isolated and as crazy as they may be, is because we're not out there. So if we've handed over the megaphone of our own work and topics to those that don't do the work and don't understand the topics, why is there even a discussion about vaccines? Why are we even talking about vaccines? It is because the anti-vaxxers have a louder mic. Why? You are the scientist, you are the trained expert, you have the grants, you have the funding, you have the backing. How is it possible that your voice is not louder than the anti-vaxxers? I think we just need to take the mic back. Put it in the hands of the people that are doing the good science, that have the good interests of their neighbors and families and friends at heart with the work that they're doing.
Call to action for people to speak up, definitely. And I think it's really nice to see that there are so many scientists in public policy positions. I didn't realize you had potentially hundreds of them in the State Department. What did you like about that job there? Like, what was your favorite part about it? And in like maybe a compare-contrast scenario from bench work, like what did it give you that you weren't really getting at the bench?
I think the reason I thrived in the policy environment was it allowed me to use a wider skill set. While I loved my bench work and loved my years at Brandeis, being in policy allowed me to find the direct intersections between the science that we do every day, our discoveries, and the needs in the community. And so for me, it was about having a direct impact on people, myself. So I was impacting people directly. Specifically, the work I did had a lot to do with bringing countries closer with the United States, doing collaborative work on global challenges that the United States couldn't solve on its own, and that no country could solve on its own. And so creating those platforms and those pathways for us to be able to come to solutions faster, in a more comprehensive way with the help of our allies around the world was really exciting. And to me, that was of great value when I saw scientists from Africa and the United States getting together to work on a common food security issue. That was when it really all made a lot of sense.
Feel like you're making that impact,
and you feel like you're there to. My role was a facilitator. I was a obstacle remover. I was the person who would bring them together and then let it happen, right? But governments can be great enablers. They can also be an impediment sometimes, right? Sometimes our policies, the way things are regulated, don't allow for the work to happen as easily. And so my job in many ways was to say, this regulation or this way we're doing things with these set of countries isn't allowing more students to go back and forth, isn't allowing professors to share their data. We don't have platforms where we can harmonize things. And we would get to a cure faster if we had one platform where we were all entering data that could be used by everybody. So a lot of the values that we hold dear now here in the US, where we're talking about open source and data sharing and platforms where, everybody can just jump in, put back into those platforms, right, were the types of things that we were promoting around the world. Was how do we make these things talk to each other, harmonize, and be open so that we can all benefit and the rising tide can lift all boats.
So it sounds like a lot of breaking of barriers and perhaps pissing people off. Do you think you ruffled too many, any feathers, or was it hard to navigate that? Was that kind of a challenge?
I think that's the reason that I mostly appreciated that I was doing this work through our diplomatic agency, because I learned from very good mentors and colleagues the art of diplomacy. I came in as a scientist and I left, I believe, as a science diplomat. I learned that science wasn't the only variable that was to be considered in any discussion of any policy or issue. Science was one, but sometimes there were geopolitical considerations that with time I learned how to understand and how to value and how to try to bring those together with what the data said, right? And sometimes I would lose out. Sometimes we were able to marry those. But my job was to make sure that the science was considered, that our best known information about an issue was on the table for decision makers to understand, whether I was a translator of that information into simple terms so that a person with a non-technical background could understand it and make a better decision down the road, or whether I was bringing it in for the first time and it wasn't a consideration before that moment, but my presence as a scientist in that decision table brought in the science, brought in a possible angle that they were not considering, that was a variable that needed to be considered. And so I don't think that I ruffled too many feathers. I learned how to be a welcome voice in the room, and I think people, and we know this, people around the world love the United States for many reasons. But one of the things that we pull the highest on is our scientific prowess, our science and our technology. It doesn't matter what country you go to. When you ask about how they feel about the United States, the one thing that we always score really high on and that people view us in a positive light almost 100% of the time, it is our science. And so it is something that we can not only use to solve global challenges with others, but it is so something that we can use to talk to others with.
Kind of open the door.
Open doors.
That's cool. I've never heard that. That's a little reassuring, I guess I would say. And I know one of the things that the United States has going for it is all of these different perspectives from a bunch of different cultures. In science, I know that's not always been a strong suit. I think in the life sciences, from my own perspective, it seems like it's improving. I know, for example, fields like astrophysics have a huge problem. It's like 90% males and 10% females, so you're getting this kind of homogenization of ideas. What are some of the things that you think diversity brings to the table in science, and how can we improve that? Or are there any areas in which we're like sorely deficient in one population or another? I think at UNC it's been pretty good, but I know I'm in a bubble myself.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, there's definitely fields where the number of women, so the gender barrier is there, and also for underrepresented minorities. I believe it's a combination of barriers, conscious and unconscious, that are there. I think we have a lot of work to do to remove those, so that all of our people are welcome in these fields. We say they are, but that doesn't really translate into the actions that send that message. When you talk to grad students and postdocs about why they chose an institution or a lab versus another, and why not a certain field over another, you tend to hear from underrepresented minorities and women how welcome they felt, what it felt like to be in a room where they were the only one, what it felt like to work with API when they weren't welcome, or when their personal circumstances were something that put them at a disadvantage, whether it was that they had children, or that they couldn't work the exact hours that their male colleagues could work, or whether they had to take a maternity leave, or and we just have not figured that out yet. We haven't figured out how to be welcoming of all. And I believe that it's something that has to change at the top. It's a message that the top levels of our academic institutions have to be able to convey to their researchers, and the right incentives have to be put in place. There are no incentives for achieving gender parity in a laboratory. There are no incentives for creating these things these policies that will help grad students integrate better and be able to manage and balance personal and professional life. It's just in science, it has for a long time not been a consideration.
Yeah.
I think that a variety of perspectives and experiences, true diversity, is essential to have the best science, to have the best minds. The best and brightest ideas can come from anywhere. And when you are indirectly selecting for a group of people, you are inadvertently leaving some of those ideas out, and you may not know what you missed out on, and we may not know as a society and as a country the damage we have done to a scientific field by leaving out a group of people that didn't feel welcome, that weren't embraced, because we didn't achieve the diversity and inclusion that we should have.
Yeah, really well said. I mean, it's hard for me to think of how I would improve it myself, but the top down definitely makes sense to me. Well, if you were to make an incentive, I'm coming from a policy background. I mean, this is just spitballing, of course. I don't expect you to have done the research, but what would you think of as a way to promote this from the top down in universities? How can we encourage maybe PIs or department administrations open their doors and be more accepting? What are those incentives that will really move it? Is it money again? Is it follow the money sort of situation?
Yeah, I think that the grant system, which is the primary driver, should be retooled to examine the track record of researchers in terms of their inclusion and diversity. And I don't have a proposal for what the incentive structure should be, or how they receive or not receive additional support, supplementals, etc. But in the same way that now the National Science Foundation has instituted a new policy where if a faculty is accused of sexual harassment, universities have to report it, and that has an impact on their ability to receive further funds or the funds they are currently receiving, which is a new policy, but it's very welcome. It is the first time that we're seeing a grants institution take matters into their own hands and say, well, you know what? If somebody is sexually harassing their students, and this person has a track record of this, and the university knows about it, maybe they shouldn't get any more money. In the same way, we have let the diversity and inclusion thing slide for so long. What happens if, and I know of these situations where you have a lab, a renowned scientist, researcher who's had a laboratory that has never had a woman on his staff in 30 years. Wow. That happens. How does that person continue to get money? How do we continue to reward that behavior by never addressing it or holding that person accountable? And I think that has to come from the grant-making institutions, whether it's foundations or whether it's the National Science Foundation or NIH. And this is a difficult topic, but it isn't any more difficult than the sexual harassment or sexual assault topic in our academic institutions. And if we can handle one, we can handle the other.
And it seems like some of that stuff is coming out of the woodwork. Like in the news, a UNC Pearl Prize winner was basically just let go, and potentially career ending for what looks like sexual harassment. So I don't want to speculate too much on that, but it does seem like things are moving.
Yeah,
that's really promising. We got to keep pushing then.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that this is a very important moment. The Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, has given women a voice, a platform to say, actually, this happened to me. And it wasn't okay, and I've lived with it. I didn't say anything. And women are finding that when they speak together in groups, in networks, they find the courage to say, okay, you know what? No more. I'm not going to just say, oh, well, that's just the way it's always been. The aspiration is that our women in science, our grad students in labs will not be fearful of being the only one, that they will undertake a career in science knowing that they have a support system, knowing that they'll be respected, and that these movements, certainly in other fields, I think are now starting to give women in science a voice as well, and we're starting to really change things.
And I will say, when we're looking to network in terms of science communication, the strongest community is the women in science community. Mm-hmm. It's really impressive.
That's wonderful to hear.
Keep it up. They're way more involved in terms of science communication. They seem like anything with women in science just has like this energy behind it that you don't see. Like SciComm is moving, it's progressing, but I think women in science in the past 6 months has exploded and it's phenomenal. And they're doing such a great job, but not only promoting diversity in science, but promoting science communication in general. It's kind of like it can be part of the same movement. It's really exciting to me to see. I'm sure it's going to benefit all of us. So, are there any other problems you see in the field of science in general, or science policy? Anything you'd want to fix or myths you want to get rid of?
I think the topic that I'm most seized with these days is what I see as a desire from scientists to get civically engaged, but not knowing how.
Right.
And they want to be more active in their communities. At least this younger crop of scientists. But they don't know what their toolkit is to do that yet. And so I've been doing speaking engagements and getting involved with different science policy groups, grad student groups around the country, to do more, to give them ideas on what kinds of things to do. And maybe I've been doing it for a little bit over 2 years now. And it's been interesting from maybe some first conversations where they were just getting together to read one article together and discuss, to now they're doing visits to their state capitals and they are inviting their senators to their labs. And that's sweet, right? That is exactly the type of engagement that I was hoping we would do more of. I always try to remind grad students, postdocs, and scientists in general, these people work for you. These people work for you. If you don't like what they're doing, you need to hold them accountable and you need to tell them. If they are cutting funding at the state level for your university, you need to get involved. You need to tell them why what they're doing is impacting you, scientific research, innovation, the community, the city, the state. These people work for you. And I recently had a group who came back to me after a year. They'd been working on all these topics, and they finally had the legislator send a staffer to visit the labs. And they planned a whole program. They put so much work into this. They planned a whole program where they were going to show the labs, and they had a small session to explain some of the research and why it was important. And after the lab tour, the staffer said, "Can I go now?" And
That's rough.
And they said, "Yes, of course," and of course they were very accommodating. And I asked, "So what did you do about it?" And they looked at me. "What do you mean? What did we do about it?" I said, "Well, how did you hold them accountable?" So we sat and went through a list of things that they could do now. How about sending a letter to the senator and saying, "Thank you so much for sending someone to come visit to better understand the work we do. We're so appreciative. It's too bad the person couldn't stay for the entire program we had planned because we had planned to X, Y, and Z. Here's some material. We'd love to have you back." How do you not seed all the ground? How do you hold them accountable? How do you bring it back to they work for you, remind them, and not ever let the science be siloed into one area while the rest of the decisions are happening elsewhere?
So it would just be persistent, I guess you would say, or keep the pressure up.
Right, and don't consider it pushy.
Okay. Yeah, that's true, because
Right?
they are your employees.
Right? They of course be respectful, of course be professional, of course be welcoming and accommodating, but don't stop asking for what you know you want and the outcome you want. If it's for more funding, if it's for an acknowledgement of the work, if it's for programs to help you recruit students from the local schools into STEM programs, these are the things that we want. These are the ways we get involved in our communities. Don't stop asking, don't stop pushing, don't stop demanding. Set aside time for your lab, your PI, your group, your department. Set aside for a department capital day, department legislature day. And the PIs and the students and the postdocs and the undergrads do this together. Why? Because they're defining science, because they're going to get civically engaged, because at the end of the day, what do legislators care about? What do elected officials care about? They're working for their communities, but they need to get elected. They care about votes. And when you demonstrate to them that what their actions are going to lead to is that your group of people, your group of very organized students, postdocs, grad students, undergrads, PIs, and administrators are not going to vote for you anymore because you cut your visit short, you didn't come, you didn't listen, and you don't really seem to care about science, so we are now organized and we are going to hold you accountable. They're going to care. And how do you demonstrate that you're organized? It is in this way. Is it engaging? It's getting civically engaged and reminding them of why they have to care.
So you mean business, I guess.
Yeah, show them your business.
Are there any online resources people can go to in terms of, I mean, obviously you want to interface with your local government, so every local government is going to have a different system, but are there any online resources, maybe templates for letters, stuff like that, or instructions on just how to structure your contact with offices to make it maybe more scary or threatening? I don't want to say threatening, but look like you mean business more. Because scientists, we aren't trained at that so well. I wouldn't know, other than dressing up a little bit, how to walk into an office like that.
I don't know of formal resources like that, but I do know that AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has several programs where you can do 2 days of policy training in DC with them, and grad students send students to that. There's also something for doing Hill visits. There's professional societies that do Hill visits. So one way to also go about it is to figure out when the Hill visits are for your particular topic of research. From the American Chemical Society to Geological, they all have days where they get engaged. And so that's another way of doing it with people that have been doing it before. But then again, there isn't one way. So I wouldn't necessarily wait to find the right template to write your letter the same way you would write a letter to your loved one requesting anything, that they come for a visit, that they, come to your wedding, the same way. Be engaged from the heart. These people, again, they work for you, and the same way you write a complaint letter to your cable company or a love letter to your significant other, write your love letter to your elected official and tell them how you're feeling, what you think they can do better, what you would like them to do in the future, and show that your vote matters and that their actions matter to you, and they will condition how you vote.
Gonna do it. I guess I've been holding off because I didn't really know how, but it sounds like I will definitely start doing that myself. I guess that also brings us to the current state of affairs in Washington, local governments. I know you mentioned in your visit at UNC that it kind of seemed like people were jumping ship sometimes, and then you had other people who said, okay, you know what, I'm gonna stay here and I'm gonna kind of fight the battle for science from inside. Can you speak to maybe the experience of your peers? If you don't want to mention names, I totally understand that, but what do you think the current feeling is in Washington about science and the future of it?
To be honest, we're in a difficult situation. What I see for the most part is colleagues who are demoralized. My former colleagues in technical agencies and non-technical agencies are having to work through conditions and an environment that is less welcoming of their input. It's not an environment where new ideas can be implemented as readily as previously. Many people keep their heads down and do the work they were doing on the programs that they were doing, if the program is still alive and still funded. Other people are having to work on other things that were less or are less relevant to the scientific endeavor. Some scientists have been muzzled at some agencies, as we've seen in the news. In some agencies, you have such as the EPA, you have a deliberate takedown of scientific advisory boards. There's an effort to really remove the scientific voice from the decision-making table. So it's a particularly difficult time for science policy and the practitioners of it in Washington, D.C. Some have chosen to stay and keep their head down to try to make it out the other side and preserve some things. Some have chosen to depart from government and use their voice elsewhere to pressure from the outside. And all of those points of view are valid. I think that we need people inside protecting things. And we need people on the outside pushing on this administration and demanding that science be funded, that science be protected. And I'm grateful for all of those voices. the voices that are pushing from inside and from outside, because we will not be silenced. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that has come out of this very difficult period, is that scientists are finding their voice. Inside of government, outside of government, many have resigned in protest and have been very vocal about it, and I think that's wonderful. You have to draw a moral line for yourself, for your field, for your peers, for your colleagues, and you have to figure out where that is and where your role is to have the most significant impact. And so I'm grateful again for all the roles that scientists are playing from wherever they can, with whatever they have, with the skill set and the tools they have, because I think that is, at the end of the day, what we will look back on and say, this is how we spoke up, this is how we use our voices, this is how we preserve the best interests of society.
Yeah, it's daunting, definitely. But I think little by little. That also brings us, I guess, to your current work. So you left Washington, you're here in Miami, Florida. It seems a little bit more comfortable than Washington, D.C., having been to both places. What are you liking about your work now? And how do you like Miami? Well, I guess I'm asking.
Sunny Miami. I lived here when I was young. My family would get transferred between Puerto Rico and Miami a bit when I was younger. So I lived in the Kendall area. I went to middle school here. So it's nice to be back. My husband and I decided to return here to get involved locally in issues that matter to us, from climate change to entrepreneurship. We think that this is a place where a lot of good and exciting things are happening. Some things are just nascent, others are just really getting going right now. But it's a community that is really exploring all of its different sides. And we are excited to be here to bring our policy expertise to the many streams of work happening here. Since we arrived, we've gotten involved in work post-hurricanes Irma and Maria, with the movement of people from Puerto Rico that came here. We've gotten involved with the Puerto Rican diaspora to work on helping the people that came, but getting involved in how policy and decision makers here deal with movements of people that are a result of extreme weather events, that are a result of a changing climate. Right? So science policy everywhere, right?
Yeah.
That produces effects that have a real impact on people's lives. And so it's been an interesting time. We're very excited to be here. We just got through a full week of a lot of exciting International Women's Day events, where we brought in scientists to speak, and we are hopeful for the impact that our policy experience can have here. And we started to find all the like-minded players in the city that also are itching to get involved in social justice from the environmental, scientific, entrepreneurship perspective. And we think that the changes that we want to see in the country at the national level are going to start here at the local level.
That's great. So I know there's an election coming up, and some people are scared about the governor of Florida getting elected to the Senate, like Rick Scott, and his views on climate change could be potentially disastrous. If you want to speculate on the chances of the election, you can, but what are the implications of electing more people who are at least skeptical about climate change? Is it more impactful in the Senate than, say, the presidential administration, or where do you think the biggest impact ultimately for our decisions and our actions as a country are going to be felt?
I think that we can't discount any of these positions, whether it's in the Senate, in DC, or whether it's a local municipal elected office. I think that we need to elect leaders from either party that will make decisions that are fact-based. I think for Florida, the importance of electing officials, representatives that will engage in a climate change agenda that will protect people, property, property values, that will protect people's health, that will take into account potential extreme weather events, that will acknowledge the importance of having researchers at our universities here, whether it's University of Miami or FIU, that are doing fantastic research on hurricane intensity and rising sea levels, and having that merge to the decisions they're making in Tallahassee and at the national level. I think those are the types of leaders we need to elect. There's definitely been elected leaders here in Florida who have been climate skeptics, despite what they see in their own backyard every day. But again, they take money from special interests, and so it's fueled by certain incentives, right? And we also have elected leaders who have what I call the convenient climate change agenda, where they pretend to be very knowledgeable in climate change, and have best environmental interests of Florida at heart, but then they vote against everything that's in people's interests, right? And so pretend moderates, which we have some of those as well. And I think citizens need to be vigilant. They need to question. They need to hold these candidates accountable. I think that especially in Florida, which is, and in South Florida where I live, which is a part of the state that we're immigrants here. Everybody here comes from somewhere else with beautiful ideas, and they come and build things. They create things. They are entrepreneurs. They are scientists. They come from everywhere with fantastic ideas. They contribute to the local economy. How can you possibly then have a mayor of the county that refuses to allow Miami to be a sanctuary city? How does that really happen, right? And so it's a very interesting place where a lot of issues about immigration, climate change, all come to a head. And all of these are issues that need to factor in to how we vote. No matter what side of the aisle you're on, how do we become a better county, city, state? How do we become a better country? How do we come to terms with who we are and how we've become? How has America become the success that it is? It has been through the hard work of so many people that came from places through so many decades. How do we embrace that and make it work for us even more? How do we embrace it so that America becomes even stronger, embracing all of who we are? How do we say, wow, we are ground zero for climate change. Florida should be leading the fight on climate change. How do we become that state? How do we represent our country around the world? Florida should be having sister city agreements with cities all over the world, cities that are impacted by sea level rise everywhere. Why aren't we leading? Why aren't we electing the leaders that will put those interests and priorities up front and take care of their people, take care of the environmental issues, make this a sustainable environment for kids to grow up in, a safe environment for kids to grow up in? These are the types of things that we have to hold leaders accountable for. And that's the way I hope that our communities here vote in the future.
So what's the future look like for you? You're gonna run for office someday? Should we plug a campaign in 2022 or whatever the next interim is?
I think I'm definitely looking at opportunities to do that. I think if the right seat becomes open and available, the right opportunity with the right local community, I'm definitely open to considering a run for office here. I come with over a decade of policy experience. This is a place where my family brought me to many times when I was young. It's a place I care about. It's in close proximity to many of the other places I care about, like Puerto Rico. It's a community that I feel at home in again, and a community that I hope I can contribute to for many years.
Great. Where can people reach you if they want to learn more? I know you're active on Twitter, right?
I'm active on Twitter. Yes, Colón in FL. and I'm on LinkedIn, and I am on Instagram. I'm on all the different social media channels.
Okay, you can't manage everything.
But yeah, I would love for folks to reach out. I think, but the most important message I'd like to get out is this is the time to get involved. This is the time for scientists to speak up for the things they care about from wherever they are, from wherever their value system drives them. This is the time.
Thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Frances Colón. I wish you luck in any future
Thank you, Connor.
office run.
Happy to be here.
It was really great to speek with you, and yeah, this is definitely a call to action. If a fire hasn't been lit under your butt before, please acknowledge that it is there now. And I know it's really inspiring for me as well. I'm definitely going to further action on pressuring my local government. Yeah, we'll see what the future holds.
Thank you.